Margaret Chin sat perfectly still in the leather chair, her hands folded in her lap as her husband of 15 years painted her as nothing more than a burden. The mahogany conference table gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of Hartwell & Associates, one of the most expensive divorce firms in downtown Seattle. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, rain streaked down the glass, matching the tears Margaret had shed in private for months. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story of hidden truth and ultimate justice, I have to ask, where are you watching from today? Drop a comment below and let me know what state or country you're tuning in from. Stories like Margaret's happen everywhere, and I love connecting with viewers around the world who understand that sometimes the quiet ones hold all the power. Thomas Chun leaned back in his chair with the casual confidence of a man who had never questioned his own narrative. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his custom-tailored suit screaming success, and his Rolex caught the light as he gestured dismissively toward his wife. He had built Chun Construction from the ground up, or so he told everyone who would listen, and now he was determined to walk away from this marriage with everything intact. Thomas turned toward his high-powered attorney, Robert Hartwell himself, and spread his hands wide with theatrical exasperation. She never worked a day in her life, Bob. Not one single day. While I was out there busting my back, pouring concrete, sweet-talking clients, and building something real, she was home arranging flowers and planning dinner parties. The woman has no idea what real work even looks like. Hartwell nodded sympathetically, his silver pen dancing across his legal pad as he documented every carefully rehearsed word. His charcoal gray suit cost more than most people made in a month, and his reputation for destroying opposing parties in divorce proceedings was legendary throughout the Pacific Northwest. The retainer alone for his services could buy a luxury car, but Thomas had paid it without hesitation because he knew Hartwell would ensure Margaret left with nothing. Margaret's attorney sat quietly at the opposite end of the table, a woman in her mid-40s named Patricia De Leon, who Thomas had mockingly referred to as bargain basement legal representation. Her simple black blazer and modest jewelry stood in stark contrast to the ostentatious displays of wealth surrounding her. She took notes with an old-fashioned fountain pen, her expression revealing nothing as Thomas continued his character assassination. 15 years I supported that woman, Thomas continued, his voice gaining momentum as he warmed to his subject. 15 years of paying for her shopping trips, her spa days, her book clubs, and her endless volunteer committees. Do you know what she contributed to building my business? Absolutely nothing. She never set foot in my office, never met with a single client, never even answered a business phone call. She lived off my hard work like a parasite. Patricia De Leon looked up from her notes for the first time, her dark eyes studying Thomas with the intensity of a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. Mr. Chun, she said, her voice soft but carrying an undertone that made Margaret straighten slightly in her chair. You mentioned that Margaret never set foot in your office. I'm curious about the early days of Chun Construction. When you first incorporated the business, where exactly did those initial planning meetings take place? Thomas waved his hand dismissively, as if swatting away an annoying fly. In my home office, obviously. I couldn't afford real office space back then. But Margaret was never involved in any of those meetings. She might have brought coffee or sandwiches, but that's about it. She wouldn't have understood the business side even if she tried. Hartwell shot Patricia a look that suggested she was wasting everyone's time with irrelevant details. His client had painted a clear picture, and he saw no reason to muddy the waters with meaningless questions about ancient history. The facts were simple. Thomas had built a multi-million-dollar construction empire through his own blood, sweat, and tears, while Margaret had contributed nothing beyond basic household management. Patricia made another note and smiled slightly. And during those early planning sessions in your home office, who handled the paperwork organization and filing? The permit applications and licensing documents can be quite complex for a new business owner. I handled everything myself, Thomas snapped, his irritation beginning to show. Look, I appreciate that you're trying to make your client look good, but let's deal with reality here. Margaret is a sweet woman, but she's never been what anyone would call business-minded. She reads romance novels and watches cooking shows. The closest she's ever come to understanding commerce is balancing her personal checkbook, and even then I usually had to help her. Margaret's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she remained silent. Her wedding ring caught the light as she adjusted her position. The modest diamond solitaire looking plain compared to the ostentatious jewelry adorning Thomas's current girlfriend, who sat in the hallway waiting for the proceedings to conclude. Patricia nodded thoughtfully and turned to a fresh page in her notepad. Mr. Chun, you mentioned licensing documents and permits. For a construction company, those requirements can be quite extensive. Building permits, contractor licenses, insurance certifications, worker compensation filings. That's quite a substantial amount of documentation for one person to manage while also running job sites and meeting with clients. Thomas's confident smile flickered for just a moment before returning full force. Like I said, I'm a hands-on kind of guy. I've never been afraid of hard work, whether it's physical labor or paperwork. That's what separates successful people from those who just coast through life on someone else's efforts. Hartwell cleared his throat and consulted his own notes. Perhaps we could move on to the current financial situation? My client has provided extensive documentation showing his sole ownership and operation of Chin Construction. The business grossed over $8 million last year, and every penny of that revenue can be traced directly to Thomas's efforts and decision-making. Patricia closed her notepad and looked directly at Thomas for the first time since the meeting began. Her expression remained pleasant and professional, but something in her eyes made Margaret sit up straighter. Mr. Chun, I have just one more question about those early incorporation documents. You mentioned handling everything yourself, but I'm wondering if you recall who witnessed your signature on the original LLC paperwork? Thomas shrugged with exaggerated nonchalance. Probably Margaret. You need 2 signatures on those forms, and she was convenient. But witnessing a signature doesn't make someone a business partner any more than watching someone cook makes you a chef. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the windows like an ominous soundtrack to the proceedings. Margaret's hands remained folded, but her knuckles had gone white as she listened to her husband systematically erase 15 years of her life from the official record. Patricia smiled and reopened her notepad, making one final entry with her fountain pen. Thank you, Mr. Chun. That's very helpful context. I think we have everything we need for now. Hartwell looked pleased with how the preliminary meeting had unfolded. His client had presented his case clearly and convincingly, while the opposing attorney had asked a few pointless questions about ancient paperwork. This was going to be easier than he had anticipated. Thomas stood up and straightened his tie, his confidence radiating through the room like heat from a furnace. He looked down at Margaret with something approaching pity. Look, I don't want to be cruel here, but facts are facts. Margaret has lived a comfortable life for 15 years without contributing anything meaningful to our financial success. She deserves to walk away with enough to maintain a modest lifestyle, but the business empire I built belongs to me. Every contract, every client relationship, every dollar of revenue came from my efforts alone. She's entitled to basic support, nothing more. The words hit Margaret like physical blows, each dismissal of her worth cutting deeper than the last. But something in Patricia's demeanor had shifted during those final questions, a subtle change that only Margaret noticed. For the first time in months, she felt a tiny spark of hope beginning to flicker in the darkness of her despair. Patricia gathered her papers with deliberate precision and looked directly at Thomas. Mr. Chun, I want to thank you for being so clear about your position regarding Margaret's contributions to Chin Construction. Your testimony today has been absolutely invaluable for our case preparation. Thomas missed the subtle emphasis in her words entirely, too intoxicated by his own perceived victory to notice the trap being carefully constructed around him. He shook hands with Hartwell and headed toward the door, already mentally planning his celebration dinner with his girlfriend. As the door closed behind him, Patricia turned to Margaret with an expression that had transformed from professional neutrality to something approaching satisfaction. Margaret, she said quietly, tomorrow we're going to show that courtroom exactly what your husband's signature looks like when it appears next to yours on every single business contract, partnership agreement, and incorporation document that built Chun Construction from the ground up. For the first time in months, Margaret Chin smiled. 3 weeks later, the King County Superior Court buzzed with the quiet tension that preceded what everyone assumed would be a straightforward divorce proceeding. Judge Elena Vasquez had been presiding over family court for 12 years, and she had seen every variation of marital breakdown imaginable. The case before her seemed routine. Successful businessman seeks divorce from housewife. Disputes over asset division expected to be minimal. Thomas Chin strode into the courtroom wearing his most expensive navy suit, his confidence radiating like cologne. He nodded respectfully to Judge Vasquez before taking his seat beside Robert Hartwell, who had arranged his legal documents with military precision across the plaintiff's table. The morning light streaming through the tall windows caught the gold trim on Thomas's cufflinks, small details that spoke to his success and status. Margaret entered quietly through the same doors, her modest gray dress and simple pearl earrings making her nearly invisible beside Patricia de Leon's understated professional attire. She took her seat at the defendant's table without fanfare, her hands folded in the same position they had maintained throughout months of legal preparation. To everyone watching, she appeared to be exactly what Thomas claimed, a woman completely out of her depth in the world of business and finance. Judge Vasquez called the proceedings to order and invited Thomas to present his opening testimony. He stood with the practiced ease of a man who had delivered countless presentations to clients and investors, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom as he began to tell his story. "Your Honor," Thomas began, his tone measured and respectful, "I stand before you today as someone who has spent the last 15 years building something meaningful from nothing. When Margaret and I married, I was a journeyman carpenter with big dreams and empty pockets. Through hard work, sacrifice, and determination, I built Chin Construction into one of the most successful commercial building companies in the Pacific Northwest." He gestured toward a stack of financial documents that Hartwell had prepared, each page meticulously organized to demonstrate the company's growth trajectory. "Our annual revenue now exceeds $8 million. We employ over 60 people. We have completed major projects throughout Washington state, including the Morrison office complex downtown and the Bellevue Medical Center expansion." Judge Vasquez nodded approvingly, making notes as Thomas continued his testimony. His narrative painted a picture of singular dedication and entrepreneurial vision, the classic American success story of a self-made man who had achieved prosperity through individual effort and determination. "Margaret," Thomas continued, and his voice softened with what appeared to be genuine affection tinged with disappointment, "has been a wonderful wife in many ways. She maintained our home beautifully, supported me emotionally during difficult times, and never complained about the long hours my work required. But she was never involved in the business side of our life. She preferred to focus on domestic concerns while I handled the commercial aspects of our partnership." Patricia de Leon observed the proceedings with the intense focus of a chess master studying her opponent's opening moves. She made occasional notes, but remained largely silent, allowing Thomas to present his version of events without interference or objection. To the casual observer, she appeared overwhelmed by the scope of Hartwell's preparation and the compelling nature of Thomas's testimony. Hartwell called his first witness, a woman named Caroline Breslin who had been part of Margaret's social circle for nearly a decade. Caroline approached the witness stand wearing designer clothing and an expression of reluctant duty, as if she were performing an unpleasant but necessary service for an old friend. Caroline testified that Margaret had always seemed content with her role as a traditional housewife, spending her days on volunteer work and social activities rather than any form of productive employment. "She never talked about business matters," Caroline explained, her voice carrying a note of practiced sympathy. "At our lunch meetings, she would discuss her garden, her book club selections, and her charity work. She seemed genuinely happy living what I would call a very comfortable, sheltered life." The testimony continued in the same vein, with Caroline describing Margaret as someone who had been fortunate to marry a successful man and had never shown any interest in or aptitude for commercial activities. She mentioned Margaret's volunteer work with local nonprofits, but characterized it as the typical busy work that wealthy wives pursued to fill their time. Thomas nodded along with Caroline's testimony, his expression confirming every detail as accurately representing the woman he had married. When Hartwell asked Caroline to describe Margaret's reaction to Thomas's business success, she painted a picture of someone who was grateful for the financial security but completely disconnected from the effort required to generate it. She would mention how blessed she felt to have such a hard-working husband, Caroline said, glancing apologetically toward Margaret. But when we would discuss our husbands' careers, Margaret always seemed a bit lost when the conversation turned to actual business strategies or financial planning. It wasn't her fault. She just wasn't wired that way. Judge Vasquez appeared to be finding Caroline's testimony credible and consistent with Thomas's own account. The picture emerging was of a traditional marriage where clear roles had been established and maintained for over a decade, with Margaret benefiting from Thomas's commercial success without contributing meaningfully to its creation. Hartwell then called Thomas's business accountant, David Morrison, who presented detailed financial records documenting the growth of Chun Construction from its modest beginnings to its current status as a major regional player. Morrison's testimony focused on Thomas's hands-on management style and his personal involvement in every significant business decision. Mr. Chun maintains direct oversight of all major contracts, Morrison explained, consulting his prepared notes with professional precision. He personally negotiates with clients, supervises project management, and makes final decisions on personnel matters. The company's success can be directly attributed to his vision and leadership capabilities. When Hartwell asked about Margaret's involvement in business operations, Morrison's answer was diplomatically brief. Mrs. Chun has never been listed as an officer of the corporation, nor has she participated in any business meetings or strategic planning sessions that I'm aware of. Her name appears on some early paperwork, but that's common in family businesses for tax and legal purposes. Patricia finally stood for her first cross-examination, approaching Morrison with a demeanor that remained respectful but carried a subtle shift in energy. Mr. Morrison, she began, you mentioned that Margaret's name appears on some early paperwork. Could you be more specific about which documents contained her signature? Morrison shifted slightly in his chair, consulting his notes before responding. The original incorporation papers, I believe, and perhaps some early loan applications. But as I mentioned, that's standard practice for married couples starting a business. It doesn't indicate actual business involvement. Patricia nodded thoughtfully and made a note. And regarding those loan applications, do you recall who was listed as the primary applicant for the initial business credit lines that allowed Chun Construction to begin operations? Thomas leaned forward slightly, his confidence remaining intact, but his attention now focused more sharply on Patricia's line of questioning. Morrison hesitated for a moment before answering that he would need to review the specific documents to provide accurate details about primary versus secondary applicants. Patricia smiled warmly and indicated that she understood completely, then asked Morrison if he recalled who had been designated as the primary contact for banking relationships during the company's first 3 years of operation. Again, Morrison indicated that he would need to review historical records to provide precise information. Thomas began to look slightly annoyed by what he perceived as Patricia's fishing expedition through irrelevant historical details. He whispered something to Hartwell, who nodded and prepared to object if the questioning continued along the same tangent. But Patricia had already moved on, thanking Morrison for his time and indicating that she had no further questions. Her brief cross-examination had planted seeds of doubt about the completeness of the financial picture without making any dramatic accusations or revelations. During a brief recess, Margaret found herself remembering the countless late nights she had spent in their home office during Chun Construction's early years. She could still picture herself hunched over spreadsheets, cross-referencing permit requirements with project timelines, double-checking insurance coverage details, and making phone calls to resolve vendor disputes while Thomas met with potential clients or managed job sites. Those memories felt like scenes from someone else's life now, as she listened to witness after witness describe her as a woman who had lived entirely separate from the business that had defined their marriage. She remembered the satisfaction she had felt when a particularly challenging project came in under budget because of her careful cost analysis, or when a potential contract disaster was averted because she had caught a crucial detail in the legal language. But in this courtroom, surrounded by polished professionals who spoke with such certainty about her life and contributions, those memories began to feel almost fictional. Perhaps Thomas was right. Perhaps she had imagined her own importance in those early years, mistaking basic administrative support for genuine business partnership. When court resumed, Judge Vasquez appeared ready to move toward a preliminary ruling based on the testimony and evidence presented. The case seemed straightforward. Hardworking entrepreneur seeks to protect the business he built from a wife who had contributed emotional support, but no practical business value. Patricia stood and addressed the court with a tone that carried new authority. Your Honor, before we proceed to any preliminary determinations, I would like to request a brief continuance to gather several additional documents that I believe will provide important context for these proceedings. Judge Vasquez looked mildly surprised, having expected the defense to present their case immediately rather than requesting additional time. What type of documents are you seeking to introduce, Ms. De Leon? Patricia consulted her notes with deliberate precision. Historical business records, banking documents, and correspondence related to the formation and early operation of Chin Construction. I believe these materials will help the court understand the complete picture of how this successful business was actually built. Thomas looked irritated by what he perceived as a delay tactic, whispering urgently to Hartwell about the irrelevance of ancient paperwork to the current asset division question. But Judge Vasquez granted Patricia's request for a 2-week continuance, instructing both parties to use the time productively. As the courtroom emptied, Margaret felt a strange mixture of hope and terror settling in her chest. For months, she had watched Thomas rewrite their shared history with such confidence that she had begun to doubt her own memories. But Patricia's questions had awakened something that had been sleeping, a recognition that the story being told in this courtroom was incomplete. What story resonated most with you in today's chapter? The way Margaret's contributions were systematically erased, or the subtle hints that there's much more to discover? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below about which part hit you the hardest. Walking out of the courthouse into the gray Seattle afternoon, Margaret realized that the next 2 weeks would determine whether 15 years of her life would be officially recorded as footnote to someone else's success story, or whether the truth about Chun Construction's Real Foundation would finally emerge from the shadows, where it had been hidden for far too long. 2 weeks later, the same King County courtroom felt charged with a different energy entirely. Patricia De Leon entered with a wheeled briefcase and 3 banker's boxes filled with documents, her previously understated presence now commanding attention through sheer preparation. Margaret followed behind her, and observers who had been present for the previous hearing noticed a subtle change in her posture, a straightening of shoulders that suggested something fundamental had shifted during the recess. Thomas arrived with his usual confidence and tact, though Robert Hartwell appeared slightly more alert than before, perhaps sensing that their opponents had not spent the continuance in idle preparation. The morning light filtering through the tall windows illuminated document boxes that seemed to promise revelations neither of them had anticipated. Judge Elena Vasquez called the court to order and invited Patricia to present her evidence. Patricia approached the bench with a manila folder containing what appeared to be routine paperwork, her demeanor professional but carrying an undertone of anticipation that made Margaret's pulse quicken. Your Honor, Patricia began, her voice clear and measured, I would like to introduce into evidence the original incorporation documents for Chun Construction LLC, filed with the Washington State Department of Commerce on March 15, 2008. These documents established the legal foundation upon which this successful business was built. She handed copies to the judge, to Hartwell, and placed one on the evidence table. Thomas glanced at the papers with mild curiosity, assuming they would confirm his narrative of single-handed business creation. But as Hartwell examined the documents more closely, his expression began to change in ways that made Thomas lean forward to see what had captured his attorney's attention. Judge Vasquez studied the incorporation papers with growing interest, her eyebrows rising slightly as she absorbed the details. Patricia waited patiently for the court to review the documents before continuing her presentation. Mr. Chun, Patricia said, addressing Thomas directly for the first time since proceedings had begun, these incorporation documents show 2 signatures on the founding paperwork for Chun Construction LLC. Could you please identify those signatures for the court? Thomas looked at the papers again, his confidence beginning to show hairline fractures. Well, obviously one signature is mine. The other appears to be Margaret's, but as I explained previously, spouses often sign incorporation papers for legal formality. It doesn't mean she was actually involved in founding the business. Patricia nodded thoughtfully and made a note. Mr. Chun, according to these documents, both signatures appear on the line designated for LLC founders, not as witness signatures. Could you explain the difference between a founder's signature and a witness signature on legal incorporation documents? Hartwell stood quickly. Objection, Your Honor. Ms. De Leon is asking the witness to interpret legal language without establishing his expertise in corporate law. Judge Vasquez considered the objection briefly before responding. I'll allow the question, but the witness may indicate if he feels unqualified to provide legal interpretation. Thomas shifted in his seat, his usual commanding presence diminishing slightly under the weight of technical scrutiny. I'm not a lawyer, but I assumed Margaret signed wherever she was told to sign. She trusted me to handle the business details and just followed my instructions for the paperwork. Patricia produced another document from her folder, this one bearing the letterhead of Northwest Business Banking. Mr. Chun, I'd like to introduce the original loan application for Chun Construction's startup financing, submitted to Northwest Business Banking in April 2008, just 3 weeks after incorporation. She distributed copies of the loan application, and the change in Thomas's expression was immediate and unmistakable. His face went pale as he stared at documents that apparently contained information he had not expected to see presented in open court. This loan application shows Margaret Chun listed as the primary applicant for Chun Construction's initial $50,000 line of credit. Could you explain why your wife was designated as the primary applicant for your business startup loan? Thomas's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to respond. The bank must have made some kind of error in their paperwork. I was obviously the one who needed the loan for my business. Patricia smiled with the patience of someone who had anticipated exactly this response. Mr. Chun, the loan application contains detailed financial information including credit scores, employment history, and personal asset declarations. The primary applicant listed shows a credit score of 795, while the secondary applicant shows a score of 642. Do you recall what your credit score was in 2008? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to catch. Thomas's jaw tightened as he realized the implications of the numbers Patricia had just presented to the court. I may have had some credit challenges from my earlier construction work, Thomas admitted reluctantly. Independent contractors sometimes face cash flow issues that can affect credit ratings temporarily, but that doesn't change who is actually running the business operations. Hartwell attempted to redirect the questioning. Your Honor, while these historical financial details are interesting, they don't address the core question of who built Chun Construction into its current successful form. My client's testimony clearly establishes his role as the driving force behind 15 years of business growth. But Patricia was already introducing her next piece of evidence, a thick folder containing what appeared to be several years' worth of banking correspondence. She handed a representative sample to the judge and continued her methodical demolition of Thomas's narrative. Your Honor, I'd like the court to review these monthly banking statements from Chun Construction's business accounts for the first 3 years of operation, 2008 through 2011. These statements consistently show Margaret Chun listed as the primary account contact, with Thomas Chun as secondary contact. Judge Vasquez examined the banking documents with visible interest, noting patterns that were beginning to paint a very different picture of Chun Construction's founding and early management. The evidence was mounting in ways that made Thomas's claims of sole business creation increasingly difficult to maintain. Mr. Chun, Patricia continued, these banking records show that all business correspondence, account notifications, and financial communications were directed to Margaret Chun as the primary contact. Can you explain why the bank would designate your wife as their primary contact for a business that you claim to have founded and operated independently? Thomas's confidence was evaporating like morning fog under direct sunlight. His hands gripped the arms of his chair as he struggled to maintain composure in the face of evidence that contradicted fundamental elements of his carefully constructed narrative. Banks have their own procedures for account management, Thomas said, his voice lacking its earlier authority. I was focused on the actual work of running job sites and meeting with clients. Margaret might have handled some of the routine banking communications, but that's just administrative support. Patricia nodded and consulted her notes before calling her first witness. Your Honor, I'd like to call Mr. James Wellington from Northwest Business Banking to provide testimony regarding Chun Construction's early banking relationships. A distinguished man in his late 50s approached the witness stand, his gray suit and measured demeanor radiating the conservative professionalism of someone who had spent decades in commercial banking. After being sworn in, he confirmed his position as Senior Vice President for Commercial Accounts at Northwest Business Banking. "Mr. Wellington," Patricia began, "you were the account manager for Chun Construction during their first 4 years of operation. Is that correct?" "Yes, that's accurate. I personally handled their account setup and maintained regular contact with their designated representatives throughout that period." "And who was designated as the primary account representative for Chun Construction during those early years?" Wellington consulted a folder he had brought with him before responding. "Margaret Chun was our primary contact for all account matters. She attended our quarterly business reviews, signed off on credit line modifications, and handled all banking relationship decisions for the company." Thomas looked as if someone had struck him with a physical blow. His mouth fell open as Wellington continued his testimony, describing Margaret's hands-on involvement in financial planning and business banking decisions during what Thomas had characterized as his period of single-handed empire building. "Mr. Wellington," Patricia asked, "in your experience, is it common for the primary account contact to be someone other than the actual business decision-maker?" Wellington shook his head definitively. "Not in commercial banking. Primary contacts are typically the individuals with authority to make binding financial decisions for the business entity. Banks require documentation establishing that authority before designating primary contact status." Hartwell jumped to his feet with visible desperation. "Objection, Your Honor. This witness is speculating about banking industry practices rather than testifying to specific facts about this particular account." Judge Vasquez considered the objection before ruling. "I'll allow the testimony, but please limit responses to your direct experience with Chun Construction's account management." Wellington nodded and continued. "Based on my direct interactions with Margaret Chun, she demonstrated comprehensive understanding of construction industry financing, project cash flow management, and risk assessment protocols. She was highly knowledgeable about their business operations and consistently made informed decisions regarding credit utilization and banking services." The courtroom had fallen completely silent except for the scratching of court reporter keys and the occasional shuffle of papers. Thomas sat frozen in his chair, watching 15 years of carefully maintained fiction crumble like a house built on sand. Patricia approached the witness stand with another document. "Mr. Wellington, I'm showing you what has been marked as Exhibit G, a credit line modification request from October 2009. Could you identify the signatures on this document?" Wellington examined the paper carefully. "This shows Margaret Chen's signature authorizing an increase in Chun Construction's credit line from $50,000 to $200,000. The request includes detailed business projections and cash flow analysis that supported the credit expansion." "And was this modification approved based on Mrs. Chen's application and supporting documentation?" "Yes, the credit expansion was approved based on her presentation and the business plan she submitted. She demonstrated clear understanding of their growth strategy and the financial requirements for scaling their operations." Margaret felt something shifting inside her chest, a recognition of truths that had been buried under years of dismissal and diminishment. She remembered that meeting with Wellington, remembered the hours she had spent preparing financial projections and risk assessments that ultimately secured the funding Chun Construction needed to bid on larger projects. Thomas finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than his usual commanding tone. "Your Honor, I object to this entire line of questioning. My wife may have handled some routine banking paperwork, but that doesn't mean she understood the actual business implications of these decisions." Judge Vasquez turned to look at Thomas directly, her expression reflecting growing skepticism about his claims. "Mr. Chun, are you suggesting that your wife was authorized to make financial decisions worth hundreds of thousands of dollars without understanding their business implications?" For the first time since proceedings had begun, Margaret spoke. Her voice was quiet, but carried a clarity that made everyone in the courtroom turn toward her with surprise. "Your Honor, if I may address the court, I believe there may be some confusion about my role in Chun Construction's founding and early operations." The courtroom fell completely silent as Margaret stood, her modest appearance suddenly seeming less like timidity and more like the controlled composure of someone who had been waiting patiently for the right moment to speak. Thomas stared at her with an expression of growing alarm, as if seeing his wife clearly for the first time in years. Mr. Chen seems to have forgotten some details about how our business partnership actually functioned during those crucial early years. Perhaps the court would benefit from hearing a more complete version of Chen Construction's actual founding story. Judge Vasquez nodded toward Margaret with an expression of genuine interest, perhaps sensing that the quiet woman who had been dismissed throughout these proceedings might finally provide the missing pieces of an increasingly complex puzzle. The courtroom remained unnaturally silent as Margaret moved toward the witness stand, her simple gray dress and pearl earrings now seeming less like indicators of meekness and more like the understated elegance of someone who had never needed to prove her worth through ostentatious display. As Margaret was sworn in, Patricia approached the witness stand carrying a briefcase that Thomas was seeing for the first time. His face had gone ashen, his usual confidence replaced by something approaching panic as he began to realize that the careful narrative he had constructed over 15 years was about to be systematically dismantled by the one person who knew every detail of Chen Construction's real history. "Mrs. Chen," Patricia began, her voice carrying new authority that filled the courtroom. "Could you please tell the court about your educational background prior to your marriage to Thomas Chen?" Margaret's voice was calm and clear, with none of the hesitation that had characterized her earlier silence. "I graduated magna cum laude from the University of Washington with a bachelor's degree in business administration, with a concentration in construction management and commercial finance. I completed my MBA from Seattle University in 2006, 2 years before Thomas and I were married." Thomas's jaw dropped open as if someone had struck him. Hartwell frantically shuffled through his papers, clearly caught completely off guard by information that had never appeared in any of their pre-trial preparation. The man who had spent months describing his wife as someone who wouldn't understand basic business concepts was learning that she held advanced degrees in exactly the fields that had made Chen Construction successful. "And what was your employment status when you met your future husband in 2007? Patricia continued. "I was working as a senior project analyst for Morrison Development Corporation, one of the largest commercial construction firms in the Pacific Northwest. My specialization was risk assessment and financial planning for large-scale building projects. My annual salary at the time was $95,000. Judge Vasquez made careful notes as Margaret's testimony continued, the picture emerging being so dramatically different from Thomas's characterization that the earlier proceedings now seemed like elaborate fiction rather than factual testimony about their marriage and business partnership. "Mrs. Chen, when you and Thomas decided to start Chen Construction, what role did you play in the business planning and startup process?" Margaret's composure remained perfect, but there was something in her eyes that suggested years of suppressed frustration finally finding voice. "I developed the entire business plan, including market analysis, competitive positioning, financial projections, and operational procedures. I identified our target market segments, researched permit requirements and regulatory compliance issues, and created the systems that allowed us to scale from startup to major commercial contractor." Patricia produced a thick document from her briefcase and handed copies to the judge and opposing counsel. "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Exhibit M, the original 47-page business plan for Chen Construction LLC, authored entirely by Margaret Chen and dated February 2008, 1 month before the company's incorporation." Hartwell examined the business plan with obvious dismay, recognizing immediately that the sophisticated financial modeling and strategic analysis contained within the document was far beyond anything his client could have produced independently. Thomas stared at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language, his expression moving from shock to something approaching terror. "Mrs. Chen," Patricia continued, "after Chen Construction was incorporated, what specific roles did you assume in the company's daily operations?" "I handled all financial management, including accounts receivable, accounts payable, cash flow forecasting, and banking relationships. I negotiated all major vendor contracts, managed our bonding and insurance requirements, and oversaw legal compliance for construction permits and safety regulations. I also managed our client relationships for contract negotiation and project planning phases." Thomas finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled protest. "Your Honor, this is completely ridiculous. Margaret might have helped with some paperwork, but she's exaggerating her involvement to try to claim credit for my hard work building this business." Patricia smiled with the patience of someone who had been anticipating exactly this reaction. "Mrs. Chun, did you maintain any records of your business activities during Chun Construction's early years?" Margaret nodded toward Patricia, who produced a digital tablet from her briefcase. "I recorded detailed voice memos documenting important business conversations and decisions. I believed it was important to maintain accurate records of contract negotiations and client communications for legal and operational purposes. With the court's permission, Mrs. Chun, could you play a representative sample of those recordings for the court?" Judge Vasquez granted permission, and Patricia activated the tablet speaker. The courtroom filled with Margaret's voice from nearly a decade earlier, clearly and professionally negotiating contract terms with a major client for what would become Chun Construction's first significant commercial project. The recording captured Margaret discussing technical specifications, delivery timelines, and payment schedules with the expertise of someone who thoroughly understood every aspect of commercial construction. Her voice carried confidence and authority as she addressed potential client concerns and negotiated favorable terms that would establish Chun Construction's reputation for reliability and quality. Thomas sat frozen as the recording played, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, recognition, and growing despair. The voice emerging from the tablet was unmistakably his wife, but it belonged to a business professional he had somehow convinced himself never existed. Patricia played 3 more recordings spanning Chun Construction's first 2 years of operation, each one featuring Margaret managing critical business situations that Thomas had apparently forgotten or deliberately ignored. The final recording captured her preventing a potential lawsuit by identifying insurance coverage gaps that could have destroyed the company during a complicated project dispute. "Mrs. Chun," Patricia asked as the recordings concluded, "during Chun Construction's first 5 years of operation, did you receive any salary or direct compensation for your management responsibilities?" Margaret shook her head with a slight smile that contained years of accumulated irony. "I never took a salary. Every dollar the company generated was reinvested in equipment, personnel, and business development. My financial contribution funded our growth, while Thomas focused on job site supervision and client relationship building." Patricia produced another document, this one bearing the letterhead of Chun Construction's accounting firm. "Your Honor, I'd like to call Robert Kim from Kim & Associates Certified Public Accountants, who has served as Chun Construction's accounting firm since 2009. A meticulously dressed Asian man in his early 40s approached the witness stand, his professional demeanor suggesting someone accustomed to dealing with complex financial documentation and business analysis. After being sworn in, he confirmed his role as Chun Construction's primary accountant for over a decade. "Mr. Kim," Patricia began, "based on your professional relationship with Chun Construction, who would you identify as the company's primary financial decision-maker during your years of service?" Kim consulted his notes before responding with careful precision. "Margaret Chun functioned as the company's unofficial chief financial officer throughout my professional relationship with them. She handled all major financial decisions, reviewed and approved all accounting reports, and managed the company's banking relationships and investment strategies." Thomas looked as if someone had removed all the oxygen from his immediate vicinity. His face had gone completely pale, and his hands gripped the arms of his chair with enough force to make his knuckles white. "Mr. Kim," Patricia continued, "could you describe Mrs. Chin's level of financial sophistication in managing Chun Construction's business operations?" Kim nodded with obvious respect. Mrs. Chin demonstrated exceptional understanding of construction industry finance, including project cash flow management, bonding requirements, and risk assessment protocols. She consistently made strategic financial decisions that maximized profitability while maintaining operational stability. Her financial management was instrumental in the company's growth trajectory. Patricia approached the witness stand with what appeared to be Chun Construction's complete financial history. "Mr. Kim, these records show that Chun Construction's annual revenue grew from $200,000 in 2008 to over $8 million in 2023. Based on your professional analysis, what factors contributed most significantly to this dramatic growth?" Kim reviewed the financial timeline with professional thoroughness before responding. The growth pattern reflects sophisticated financial planning, strategic reinvestment of profits, and careful management of operational costs. The decision-making that drove this growth required advanced understanding of construction industry dynamics and commercial finance principles. Thomas finally exploded from his chair with desperate energy. This is all lies. Margaret never understood the first thing about running a business. I built Chin Construction with my own hands, my own sweat, my own vision. She's trying to steal credit for 15 years of my hard work. Judge Vasquez looked at Thomas with an expression that had moved from mild skepticism to open disapproval. Mr. Chun, please control yourself and allow the proceedings to continue in an orderly fashion. Patricia waited patiently for Thomas to resume his seat before addressing Margaret again. Mrs. Chun, could you help the court understand why your extensive business involvement was not widely known outside your marriage? Margaret's composure never wavered, but her voice carried undertones of accumulated hurt that made the courtroom feel suddenly more intimate. Thomas preferred to be recognized as the public face of Chin Construction. He felt that clients would be more comfortable dealing with a male contractor, especially during our early years when the construction industry was even more male-dominated than it is today. I agreed to work behind the scenes to support our shared success. She paused briefly before continuing with quiet dignity. I believe that our marriage was a true partnership where individual recognition mattered less than collective achievement. I was proud to contribute to Thomas's public success because I thought we were building something together. The words hit Thomas like physical blows, each acknowledgement of her sacrifice highlighting the magnitude of his betrayal in attempting to erase her contributions entirely. He slumped in his chair as the full scope of his wife's hidden involvement became undeniable. Patricia produced one final document from her briefcase, this one appearing to be a legal contract with multiple signatures and official seals. Mrs. Chun, I'm showing you what has been marked as Exhibit R, a major construction contract with Bellevue Medical Center from 2015. Could you identify the signatures required for contract execution? Margaret examined the document with professional familiarity. This contract required dual signature authorization from Chun Construction's executive management. My signature appears alongside Thomas's signature, indicating joint approval and legal responsibility for contract performance. Patricia handed copies of similar contracts to the judge, each one spanning Chun Construction's major projects over the past 8 years. Your Honor, these contracts collectively represent over $30 million in business commitments, all requiring Margaret Chin's signature for legal execution. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Thomas sat in stunned silence as Patricia methodically demonstrated that his wife had been the hidden architect of Chun Construction's success, the strategic mind behind every major business decision, and the financial genius who had transformed his modest construction skills into a multi-million-dollar empire. Judge Vasquez reviewed the mountain of evidence with expressions that reflected growing amazement at the completeness of Margaret's business involvement. The quiet woman who had been dismissed as a housewife was revealed to be one of the most sophisticated construction industry executives in the Pacific Northwest. Mrs. Chun, Patricia asked for her final question, is there anything else you would like the court to understand about your role in building Chin Construction? Margaret looked directly at Thomas for the first time since taking the witness stand, her expression carrying forgiveness mixed with profound disappointment. I love my husband, and I love the business we built together. I never needed public recognition because I thought our success belonged to both of us. But I cannot allow 15 years of my professional life to be erased as if I never existed. Judge Elena Vasquez set down her pen and looked directly at Thomas Chun with an expression that contained 15 years' worth of accumulated judicial disappointment. The courtroom fell silent except for the quiet hum of the ventilation system and the distant sounds of Seattle traffic filtering through the tall windows. What followed would be remembered by everyone present as one of the most decisive moments they had ever witnessed in family court. Mr. Chun, Judge Vasquez began, her voice carrying the controlled authority of someone who had spent decades separating truth from fiction. This court has rarely encountered such a systematic misrepresentation of facts in divorce proceedings. The evidence presented today demonstrates that your characterization of Mrs. Chin's role in building Chin Construction was not merely incomplete, but deliberately deceptive. Thomas tried to interrupt, his voice cracking with desperation. Your Honor, please let me explain. Judge Vasquez raised her hand firmly, cutting off his protest. Mr. Chun, you have had ample opportunity to present accurate testimony. Instead, you chose to present a fictional narrative that portrayed your wife as a dependent when the evidence clearly shows she was the primary architect of your business success. The judge consulted her notes, reviewing the mountain of evidence that had been presented throughout the morning. Based on Mrs. Chin's educational credentials, her documented business contributions, her financial management responsibilities, and her legal authority in contract negotiations, this court finds that she was not merely a contributor to Chun Construction's success, but its primary strategic and financial architect. Thomas's face had gone completely white, his hands shaking as the implications of the judge's words began to sink in. Behind him in the gallery, his girlfriend Amanda Hartley shifted nervously in her seat, her designer handbag clutched tightly as she processed the financial devastation that was about to unfold. Judge Vasquez continued with methodical precision. Mrs. Chun provided the business plan, secured the initial financing, managed all financial operations, and handled the strategic decisions that transformed a modest construction operation into an $8 million enterprise. Meanwhile, Mr. Chin focused on operational supervision and client relations, important functions but subsidiary to the strategic and financial leadership provided by his wife. Patricia De Leon sat calmly beside Margaret, her expression reflecting professional satisfaction at seeing justice properly administered. The months of careful document gathering and strategic preparation had culminated in this moment of complete vindication for her client. Furthermore, Judge Vasquez said, her voice gaining intensity, Mrs. Chin never received direct compensation for her extensive business contributions, instead reinvesting all potential earnings into company growth for the benefit of the marital partnership. This court finds such selfless dedication to shared success to be exemplary, making Mr. Chin's attempt to deny her contributions particularly reprehensible. The judge paused to allow the full weight of her findings to settle over the courtroom before delivering her verdict. Based on the evidence presented, this court awards Margaret Chin 75% ownership of Chun Construction LLC and all related business assets, including real estate, equipment, contracts, and intellectual property. Thomas collapsed forward in his chair as if someone had physically struck him. The business empire he had claimed to build single-handedly was being transferred almost entirely to the woman he had dismissed as a mere housewife. His attorney Robert Hartwell sat in stunned silence, recognizing that there was no legal basis for appealing a decision supported by such overwhelming documentary evidence. Additionally, Judge Vasquez continued, Mr. Chin will be responsible for all legal fees and court costs associated with these proceedings, as this court finds his misrepresentation of facts to constitute a frivolous defense that wasted significant judicial resources. In the gallery, Caroline Breslin and the other women who had testified about Margaret's supposedly idle lifestyle exchanged horrified glances. They had aligned themselves with what they believed would be the winning side, only to discover that they had publicly humiliated a woman who was far more accomplished than any of them had ever imagined. Amanda Hartley stood abruptly and fled toward the courtroom exit, her high heels clicking rapidly against the marble floor as she abandoned Thomas to face the consequences of his deception alone. The woman who had eagerly anticipated sharing in Thomas's wealth was discovering that his assets had never actually belonged to him in the first place. Your Honor, Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper, please reconsider. If you take away my business, I'll lose everything. I won't be able to support myself, let alone pay any kind of spousal support. This will destroy my entire life. Judge Vasquez looked at Thomas with an expression that mixed legal authority with personal disgust. Mr. Chun, you attempted to destroy your wife's life by systematically erasing 15 years of her professional contributions. This court has simply restored the accurate ownership structure that should have been recognized throughout your marriage. Margaret remained seated with perfect composure, her hands folded in the same position they had maintained throughout months of legal proceedings. But now her stillness suggested the calm confidence of someone who had finally seen justice properly administered rather than the defeated resignation that had characterized her earlier appearances. The judge gathered her papers, and prepared to adjourn the proceedings. Mrs. Chun, this court recognizes that you built Chun Construction through your strategic vision, financial expertise, and business leadership. You are hereby restored to your rightful position as the company's primary owner and decision-maker. As court officials began filing out of the room, Caroline Breslin approached Margaret with obvious desperation written across her face. "Margaret," she said, her voice carrying a pleading tone that contrasted sharply with her earlier confident testimony. "I hope you understand that we didn't realize the full situation. If there's anything we can do to make amends." Margaret stood gracefully and gathered her papers without acknowledging Caroline's presence. She walked past her former friends with the dignity of someone who no longer needed to waste energy on people who had revealed their true character during her moment of greatest vulnerability. Thomas remained slumped in his chair, staring at the floor as the reality of his situation became fully apparent. The man who had confidently strutted into court expecting to claim sole ownership of an $8 million business empire would be walking out with a fraction of what he had possessed just hours earlier. What part of today's justice delivery resonated most with you? Was it seeing Margaret finally get recognition for her contributions, or watching Thomas face the consequences of his deception? Let me know in the comments what you think about how this case was resolved. Patricia gathered her documents and briefcase, her professional satisfaction evident in the efficient way she organized the evidence that had achieved such complete victory for her client. The bargain basement attorney that Thomas had mocked had just delivered one of the most decisive courtroom victories in recent memory. As Margaret walked toward the courthouse exit, her modest gray dress and pearl earrings now seemed like the understated elegance of someone who had never needed external validation to know her worth. She had spent 15 years building an empire while allowing someone else to take credit, but she would never make that mistake again. Behind her, Thomas remained alone in the empty courtroom, facing the devastating realization that everything he thought he had built belonged to someone else, and always had. 6 months after the courthouse drama that had redefined her life, Margaret Chin sat behind the mahogany desk that had once symbolized Thomas's authority, reviewing construction proposals for what would be Chin Construction's largest project to date. The corner office overlooked Elliott Bay, its floor-to-ceiling windows framing the Seattle skyline like a testament to how dramatically circumstances could change when truth finally emerged from shadows. The brass nameplate on her desk read Margaret Chin, Chief Executive Officer, in elegant script, replacing the simple Mrs. Thomas Chun identification that had decorated her previous workspace in their home office. Everything about her professional environment now reflected her actual role in the company she had built from concept to commercial powerhouse. Her assistant knocked and entered with the day's correspondence, including several partnership proposals from major Pacific Northwest development firms who had suddenly discovered Margaret's existence after 15 years of dealing exclusively with Thomas. The construction industry had been quietly buzzing since news of the divorce settlement had spread through professional networks, with many clients expressing relief at finally being able to work directly with the strategic mind behind Chin Construction's success. Margaret opened the first partnership proposal from Morrison Development Corporation, the same firm where she had worked before starting Chin Construction. Their offer included a joint venture agreement for a $200 million mixed-use development project, with specific language requesting Margaret's personal involvement in all strategic planning phases. How ironic, she thought, remembering how Thomas had convinced her to leave Morrison Development to support his entrepreneurial dreams, claiming that her corporate salary would distract from building their shared business empire. Now Morrison was offering her a partnership that would establish Chin Construction as one of the region's premier commercial developers. Her phone buzzed with a call from Caroline Breslin, the third attempt that week from her former friend who had testified so convincingly about Margaret's supposed lack of business acumen. Margaret allowed the call to go to voicemail, just as she had ignored Caroline's previous attempts to arrange a lunch meeting to discuss misunderstandings and renewed friendship. The voicemail, when Margaret finally listened to it, contained the usual mixture of justification and desperation. "Margaret," Caroline's voice pleaded through the speaker, "I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive us for not understanding your situation. Several of us were wondering if you might consider working with our husbands' companies on some of your upcoming projects. We had no idea about your business background and would love the opportunity to make things right. Margaret deleted the message without responding, just as she had deleted the previous appeals from women who had spent years dismissing her as an idle housewife, but now recognized her as someone who could potentially advance their own family's financial interests. Her assistant brought in the afternoon newspaper, folded open to the business section where a small article described Thomas's new employment situation. Former construction executive takes field position with Rainier Builders, the headline read. Though the article failed to mention that his field position involved manual labor on job sites supervised by men who had once bid against Chun Construction for major contracts. Margaret felt no satisfaction in Thomas's downfall, only a quiet sadness that their marriage had ended with such unnecessary deception and conflict. She had genuinely loved the man she thought she had married, the partner she believed they had been building something meaningful together. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was professional, an attempt to erase her contributions to work that had defined most of her adult life. Her phone rang with a call from Patricia De Leon, who had become both attorney and trusted advisor during Margaret's transition to public business leadership. Patricia, she answered, what can I do for you today? Margaret, Patricia's voice carried excitement that made Margaret smile. I just received confirmation that the Seattle Business Journal wants to feature you in their Women in Construction Leadership profile. They're particularly interested in your story about building a successful company while working behind the scenes, and how your experience might help other women in similar situations. The interview request prompted Margaret to reflect on lessons she hoped other women might learn from her experience. Document everything, she would tell them. Keep records of your contributions, maintain your own professional relationships, and never allow someone else to become the sole public face of work you're building together. She had been quietly implementing these principles in her new business relationships, ensuring that her name appeared prominently on all contracts, correspondence, and partnership agreements. The women who contacted her seeking business opportunities were often surprised by her insistence on formal documentation and clear authority structures, not understanding that Margaret would never again allow her professional identity to be hidden or diminished. Her assistant knocked again, this time announcing that Thomas was in the lobby requesting a meeting. Margaret considered the request briefly before instructing her assistant to inform him that all communication should go through their attorneys, just as she had responded to his previous attempts to discuss their business relationship directly. Thomas had been calling regularly since the divorce settlement, initially threatening legal appeals, but gradually shifting toward pleas for Margaret to consider some form of business partnership that might restore his income and status. She had declined all such discussions, recognizing that their professional relationship had ended permanently when he chose to deny her contributions publicly. What resonated most with you about Margaret's incredible journey from dismissed housewife to recognized business leader? I'd love to hear in the comments which part of her transformation inspired you the most, and whether you've ever had your own contributions overlooked or minimized. Margaret returned to reviewing the Morrison Development Partnership proposal, noting language that specifically acknowledged her role as Chun Construction's strategic architect and primary decision-maker. The recognition felt gratifying not because it validated her worth, which had never been in question, but because it represented the end of years spent hiding her capabilities to protect someone else's ego. At 4:30, she gathered her papers and prepared to leave the office for a construction site inspection, something she had always done, but now did openly as Chun Construction's acknowledged leader. The hard hat hanging behind her door bore her name and title in bold letters, visible symbols of authority she no longer needed to conceal. As she walked through the office, her employees greeted her with genuine respect and professional courtesy, interactions that felt natural after months of working directly with the person who had always made the major decisions but previously remained invisible. The company culture had improved dramatically since Margaret's leadership became official, with clearer communication and more efficient decision-making processes. Driving toward the construction site in her company vehicle, Margaret reflected on how completely her life had changed simply by refusing to allow someone else to define her contributions. The same strategic mind, financial expertise, and business leadership that had built Chun Construction remained unchanged, but now operated openly rather than from shadows. She pulled into the construction site and noticed Thomas working with a crew installing concrete forms on a competing project across the street. Their eyes met briefly through her windshield, but neither acknowledged the other. He had made his choice to deny their partnership, and she had made hers to move forward without him. Margaret stepped out of her vehicle and walked toward the job site office where her project managers were waiting with progress reports and budget updates. Her hard hat caught the late afternoon sun as she reviewed plans for a medical complex that would bear Chen Construction's name prominently on the building directory, with Margaret Chen listed as principal contractor. The empire they had built together would continue growing under her leadership, but it would never again be hidden behind someone else's identity. She had learned that the most dangerous thing a capable woman could do was allow someone else to take credit for work that belonged to her, and she would spend the rest of her career ensuring that other women learned the same lesson before it was too late.